Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us on this not particularly pleasant evening. I'm Bart Schultz, the director of the Civic Knowledge Project at the University of Chicago. The Civic Knowledge Project is one of the many organizations collaborating to bring you the Poverty, Promise, and Possibility initiative, of which tonight's lecture is a part. This has been going on for over a year. We've accumulated quite a lot of material on the very troubling, difficult, horrendous problems of urban poverty that we're confronting. Increasingly, it seems, with every passing day. And I want to encourage all of you to please visit the website, povertyinitiative.uchicago.edu. If you Google or Bing Poverty, Promise, and Possibility, that will take you to the website, and you can see all the material that we have up there. Lots of videos of earlier talks. We've addressed many crucial issues, poverty in education, poverty, urban health care, lots of the key issues concerning urban poverty that affect us right here on the south side of Chicago. And I stress this because I'd really like your help at this point. The more people we can get visiting the website and reviewing the material, looking at the videos, looking at the additional links, PowerPoint presentations, and what have you available on there, the more feedback I hope to get about what you think is the most useful material, what you think we should really highlight as we move into the next stage of the program and try to bring all this material into some kind of manageable shape that can be used in the public schools on the south side of Chicago, that can be used for example, orientation work with the neighborhood schools interns, doing volunteer work in the schools surrounding the university, things like that. So we're trying to put this into some kind of manageable shape, bullet pointing, highlighting the stuff that really seems the most useful, the most urgent, right? And you can help with that. I really appreciate your help. You can email me at rschultz@uchicago.edu. My phone number is up there on the website. Please feel free to get in touch with me. Join us for some workshops that we're going to be having in November, where we will review this material and try, in collaboration with the Media Initiatives group here, to edit it down and to put it in the best possible form. Okay? So please help. That's the crucial message here. And with that, I'll move on to introduce our speaker here. As I keep reassuring people, very often it turns out that our best discussions are with our smaller audiences, and I'm sure that will be the case tonight. Our speaker is absolutely outstanding, thrilled to have her as part of this initiative. Evelyn Brodkin is Associate Professor at the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration. She holds a PhD in Political Science from MIT. She has published widely on the politics of poverty and inequality, social welfare policy, street-level organizations, and management reform. Her commentary, Requiem for Welfare, first published in Dissent magazine, has been widely reprinted in a variety of books and journals. Currently, she is working on a book of international organizational studies of workfare and work activation titled Work and the Welfare State, the Politics and Management of Policy Change. Internationally, Professor Brodkin is on the steering committee of a research network examining labor market and social policy. She also has held visiting appointments at universities in Mexico and Australia, and will be a visiting professor at the University of Strasbourg, France, later this fall. So we're very fortunate to have her before she takes off, and please give her a warm welcome.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out tonight on this dreary, cold Chicago night. I'm sure we'd all like to be in France at the moment. And I see a number of folks here I know, former students, colleagues, and it's nice to see you and meet some new people as well. There's a familiar old curse. Many different nationalities and ethnic groups claim it as their own, so I will simply call it the curse. And it says, "May you live in interesting times." And surely we do live in an interesting time. And it brings all sorts of challenges, problems, and issues to the forefront of our lives and, in fact, the lives of others in our community and the world. In fact, we're living through what we now understand to be the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression. And the insecurity that this crisis has spawned has provoked public anger, frustration, even fear that we see spilling out into the streets of Chicago, Wall Street, and around the globe. So that the issues we're talking about tonight, we are experiencing locally, but they are also being experienced in a variety of ways globally. And we're going to talk a great deal tonight about this broader international perspective. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the basic parts of this story. We have an unemployment rate right now around 9.1%. I just heard Illinois' unemployment rate has hit double digits. We are now at 10% in the state of Illinois. And we have a poverty rate in this country of 15%. Now, stop a minute and think about it. We are one of the richest, most abundant countries in the world, and 15% of our population lives in poverty. And that's just by drawing an artificial line we call poverty at $22,000 plus for a family of 4. What about the family with $23,000 or $25,000? The 15% is bad, but it's worse than it looks. How can this be? In addition, we know the burdens of poverty and hardship don't fall equally across our society. Some groups are bearing the burden more than others. It's particularly difficult in minority communities, among children in single-parent households, and increasingly, hate to say it, among young adults unable to find work. I hope the curse is lifted for all of you. So yes, this is a severe economic crisis, but it's not just an economic crisis, it's also a social crisis. It affects the immediate well-being of individuals, but also their potential for the future. There are some people now speaking of the possibility of a lost generation, and I hope this turns out to be an exaggeration. But tonight, I'd like to engage you in a conversation about these issues, in a conversation about poverty and inequality, but a conversation that does more than simply go through a litany of grim and dispiriting statistics, although, to be honest, I'll do that. But we need to understand what is in order to think constructively about what can be. And I really loved the title of this series, Poverty, Promise, and Possibility. And when I started thinking about what I wanted to do tonight, I found that what I wanted to think about was possibilities and how we can think about them in constructive ways, where the openings are, what we need to be able to begin to think about perhaps the paths we haven't taken. So as Bart mentioned, I'm currently working on a book with a number of international colleagues that looks at the way welfare states balance the relationship between work and the social well-being of their populations. And in the course of this book, I've actually learned a great deal from my collaborators about what other countries do. I found both commonalities and differences in the ways other advanced market democracies address this basic problem. And this is, I'm talking about advanced market democracies. So countries that, similar to ours, have resources, have relatively educated populations, have a democratic system of government, but also, like us, have a market economy. How do they work it? Do we all do the same things? Are the things we see here inevitable because they're the same across all these countries? Or are there differences we might learn from? And I've come to think about this a lot because when I started doing international work, I don't know, 6 or 7 years ago, I would meet with my international colleagues. I'd often be the only American in the room. And my sense was that when I would start to talk about what we did in the US, there was at best tolerance for hearing it, and at worst unconcealed contempt. Not of me personally, I don't think, but a sense, why would we want to be like the US? We don't want to have a country where people are homeless in the streets, where 22% of children live in poverty, and where people struggle for their day-to-day lives. Now, you can ask the question, so, sure, nobody wants that, but are they doing any better? So this is one of the things that I want to look at tonight, and see what we can learn from the experiences of other countries. Second, take a look at some of our key policies and see how they're doing before and since the economic crisis, and to also ask some big questions or get us thinking about what kind of society we want to build and what's possible. I've come to this position in a way because if we don't have a sense of possibility, we can't act. One has, and not a fantasy, but a sense of possibility. So I want to go through a little exercise that I call broadening the political imagination, and I want you all engaged in it. It's a thought experiment. I've adapted it from something that's been used elsewhere, notably on PBS and in an experimental study by some Duke colleagues. If you've seen this, don't give it away. If you haven't seen it, I think you'll find it interesting. So, these were my key questions. You've now heard them. So I'm going to show you pie charts for 3 countries. Each of them distributes the wealth differently. And after you've looked at the 3 countries, I'm going to ask you which country you want to live in. Here's country 1. And of course, you know in this business, we divide populations into fifths. I couldn't tell you why, we just do. It's top fifth down to the bottom fifth. I don't particularly like the terminology. I'm open to other ways of describing this, but here's what we got. So here's country 1. Take a look. I'm going to ask you if you want to live there. Country 1. Here's country 2. Note the yellow, that 36%, is the most affluent fifth of the population. The orange, the 11%, is the least affluent part of the population, and the others are in the middle. So take a good look. Think about country 1 versus country 2, or would you like to live in country 3? Okay, so those who want to live in country 1, stick your hands up in the air. Okay. Oh, and I love all you. Those who want to live in country 2. Okay, interesting. And who wants to live in country 3? All right. We got 1 for country 3. Now, before we take a look at the answers, which countries do you think these charts represent? Now, I'm not going to ask you to say it out loud. Think about it yourself. You may want to jot it down on a piece of paper. Which country 1 in this list? Each one, there is a country that corresponds. Country 1, country 2, country 3. Ready to see what they are? You've all committed now to what you think, right? The results. Fredonia, where you all want to live, I'm sorry, it doesn't exist. But it's a good idea, obviously, to people here. Country 2, which comes the closest, is Sweden. And the place only one gentleman preferred is exactly where we are. Now, again, this is not the distribution of income, it's the distribution of wealth, but we will look at the other parts of the picture too. I will later tell you the results on the same experiment with a nationally random sample of the population, but you're going to have to wait for it. So, we have these three alternatives, and at least those among you here clearly prefer the path we have not taken. So let's take a look. We can't look at Fredonia, I'm sorry, but we can look at Sweden and Denmark, which are the closest to that second chart. And what I want to show you first is what markets do. Markets produce inequality. And I'm not saying good or bad. Markets produce inequality by necessity. There has to be an accumulation of capital. That's one part of the problem. Secondly, people are differently positioned in the market. Markets are structured in different ways so that some people get a lot and others don't get so much. There are a variety of reasons that markets on their own produce inequality, and in recent decades have been producing greater inequality over time. Whoa, the lines were straight on the graph, but not up here. Anyway, I'll tell you, yeah, but you could already guess, I think. What I've done with the arrows is to show you in terms of market inequality. First of all, you see market inequality across, these are all European countries plus the US. The first arrow is Sweden, the second arrow is the US, the third arrow is Denmark. You see all of these, all but at the bottom, most of these countries have been producing increasing inequality through the markets. But this is just our starting point, because each of these countries responds differently to the problem of market inequality. Here we have a chart showing public social expenditures normalized by GDP and how they relate to earnings inequality of employed individuals in the population. Again, you get these snapshots. And lo and behold, the countries that do the most, spend the most on labor market and social programs and produce the least inequality or the most equality. And those who spend the least, I mean, it's really amazing how the extent to which the correlation shows up here. At the top, you're going to get used to this, Denmark and Sweden. At the bottom, the far bottom, below everybody, the US. The UK, the Netherlands, Australia, they're all more or less in the middle. Now, I know at least some of you are thinking, get over it, Denmark is not the US. Denmark is a little bitty country made up of little bitty islands with a homogeneous population, and you can't compare Denmark to anything. And you're partly right. It is a little bitty country on a lot of islands, and it is more homogeneous than the US, although this is changing. And I think the Danes will be the first to tell us they haven't quite got a grasp of this yet. But that's not the whole story. That's not the whole story. And if you look across other countries that are more heterogeneous, you see as well these kinds of differences hold up. So it's part of the story, but it's not the whole story. Poverty rates, again, if you look at poverty rates after taxes and government programs, and here in Europe, poverty is measured as 40% of median income. So we're using a standardized measure across populations. And the lowest poverty rates, Denmark and Sweden. Next is France and Finland. And over on the other end, Korea, the US, Turkey, and Mexico. Let's look at job insecurity. This is the other part of how government programs can balance flexible markets and individual risk. Again, here we see differences in spending. Oh, this is really unreadable. Differences in spending across countries and the degrees of job insecurity, and it's a similar picture, the US, Japan, Korea, and interestingly, the UK are among the most insecure and lowest spenders on social and labor market policy. And of course, on the other side, we have Denmark. Sweden has moved to the middle here. So it's not all foreordained as far as that goes. What I'm trying to, I could say this simply, but you'd have no reason to believe it. I want to show you in the data that the way governments respond to market-based inequality matters. Why do I want to really show you this point in a variety of different ways? Because if it matters, it tells you something about what's possible. If nobody could do it, then you'd have to say, you know what? We got to get used to it. This is just how it is. But it's not just how it is. In other places, it's different. So it's possible. Not a straight transfer. Can't transplant Denmark to Chicago. It's a strange idea. But there's something in their basket of policies that seem to make a difference. I'll go quickly through some of the others. This is not just a matter of material inequality. UNICEF made an effort to look at child inequality in child well-being, taking account not only of material well-being, but also health and education. And they grouped countries numerically. You're getting used to this story now? You can do it with your eyes closed. And looking just at material well-being, they used the same analysis. You know, I won't say this is the most empirically precise analysis I've ever seen, but you still get a sense of the proportion here. And again, you see the US grouped with Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland in terms of the relative material well-being of its children. Anybody mad? Okay. So, I had to stop from time to time as I was putting this together. I knew all these data, but putting them all together in one place had an impact on me as well. All right, so now we've seen comparatively that markets create inequality, but governments can do something about it. And depending what they do, you see consequences for people's well-being, their job security, and their earnings. So, what are we dealing with here? In terms of inequality, and I think this is pretty familiar probably to most of you by now, we have increasing income inequality in this country. The chart starts in 1967, so you can't read that, I can tell. And it goes up to 2010, but I've put that over on the line. Again, we have the quintiles. And you see that in 1967, the most affluent 20% had 43.6% of the income. And by 2010, those lucky folks had 50.2% of the income. The amount of income going to the least affluent fifth in 1967 was 4%. How low can you go? Well, we got them down to 3. We'll see where we go from here. And another thing I just want to direct your attention to when you hear about the worried middle class, the middle is getting squeezed. You can't send that much additional income up to the top 20% by only taking it from the poorest. There isn't enough. It's coming from, largely from the second and third groups in that distribution. Another way to look at it, and this is after, of course, the US government has done its tax thing, giving to some and taking from others. It's a complicated business. After-tax income inequality has increased, and again, you see the story. It is not only the top fifth, but the top 1% that has shown incredible income growth. And this chart happens to go from 1979 to 2003, which is taking account of the Reagan tax cuts. And I'll show you some data on the Reagan tax cuts for the rich, which, of course, changing them is kind of a matter you're hearing about these days in Washington. Well, not changing them is this. And here we see this is post-Reagan, the Bush tax cuts for the wealthy, and the effective income tax rate for the top 400 households is the blue, and households with an income, top 400, or the households with an income over $1 million. So we see tax policy as contributing to growing income inequality in the US. It's not the only thing. There are many things, and this is yet another. I thought we ought to take a look pre and post economic crisis. I mean, maybe all this is just because since the economic crisis, things have really gone haywire. And when it normalizes again, we'll be okay. Well, these trends, income inequality trends, considerably preceded the economic crisis, although they are being made worse by it. So here we see changes in real income across these groups. And here, I think in particular, you can see some of the decline that's occurred in the middle. And this is 2007, 2008 is the gray. And this is the median household. And you really see a decline in there. The group that has actually started to recover the most during the recession, of course, was our favorite, the top 5%. So I'm showing you many different snapshots, but the underlying picture becomes even clearer because no matter how you cut this up, you can think of the way scientists carve up molecules and you see them in all these different dimensions. We're looking at all these different ways of seeing it. And the degree may change, but the same story of growing income inequality and income and wealth going from the middle to the top over time is quite clear. Again, uneven distribution. Even in this country, though, it was different in earlier periods. This graph shows the period 1946 to 76, when the benefits of a growing economy were somewhat more widely shared. In the period from 1976 to 2007, we had winners and we had losers. And the big winners were the top 1%. And I don't say this to vilify any group in particular. These data have a certain advantage of sterility. They don't put anyone into those columns specifically. because they are telling a structural story. They are not telling a story of a robber baron who went to town and took everything in sight. They're telling a story of a set of structural and policy choices that has produced growing income inequality. And I really think this is important if we're thinking about what is possible to do. If it's just a greedy individual, it's a different story from if this is a consequence of government decisions or non-decisions, both of which are important. Now that was the income story, the wealth story. Quite similar. The bottom 4/5 have lost shares of the distribution of wealth, and the top 1/5 has gained, and again, the top 1% has gained the most. I put an arrow over there. I'm trying to remember why. In 2007, 2009, I think, okay, who can guess why? I now remember why. Lynette.
The recession?
Yeah. After the recession, or during the recession, 2007 to 2009, the top 1/5 was still accumulating wealth. And the bottom 4/5 was losing it. Now, a lot of this is the housing market. But even the bust of the housing market plays out differentially over these groups. Okay. So turning from inequality to poverty, inequality is one thing, and that is a problem. Poverty is part of the inequality story in this country because that least affluent 20%, in Fredonia, we can't assume, since it doesn't exist, that the least affluent 20% are poor. They just have 20% of the pie. In the US, when we talk about shares, of course, we're talking about the share of the pie. When we talk about poverty, we're talking about absolute resources. And I'm sure everyone here knows the poverty line is a problematic concept in a whole variety of ways. Nonetheless, it gives us pictures over time that are consistent. We estimate a poverty level income based on a basket of food. It's got its problems, but it gives you a consistent measure. Again, a family of four. For a family of four, it's in the vicinity of $22,000 a year. Now, everybody just sit here for a minute. Yourself and 3 other people to support on $22,000 a year in the city of Chicago. How would you do that? So to be poor is not simply to be a line on a graph, although I'm showing you a lot of graphs. But to be poor is to experience the world in a particular way and to lack access to certain basic resources that people in other income groups probably take for granted. A poverty income for a family is less than your tuition at the University of Chicago for a year. Let's put it that way. Okay, so I always get uncomfortable when I talk about poverty for too long as a set of data points rather than to remind us we're talking about people who have to live in particular ways. Anyway, many of you are quite familiar with all of this. And what do we see here? Well, the poverty rate fluctuates, as does the number of people in poverty. And in fact, before any of the government programs of the Great Society and before Social Security was widely accessible and indexed to inflation, the poverty rate in this country was higher than it is today. But this big dip we see in the poverty rate in the 60s was not entirely, but considerably related to choices we made through our government about what tax policy would be, what Social Security policy would be, and what other kinds of income and support policies would be. The current increase, of course, is not unexpected. And the number of people who are poor today, 46.2 million, is the highest since these records have been kept. Again, even the burdens of poverty are not shared equally across groups. There are differences by age, and I don't know if you can read that over on the side. The top line, this is the 22% poverty rate is kids, it's under 18. The second is adults, 18 to 64. And the 9%, the lowest poverty rate, is experienced by seniors over 65 years of age. And again, this is the great American success story of Social Security. Remember 1959 versus today? Social Security has been a huge achievement in terms of keeping seniors from poverty, and particularly, again, indexing it to inflation. More unequal burdens. Some populations are more vulnerable to poverty than others. There are a million ways you could cut up these categories. I chose this chart here, which looks at the burden of poverty for African American youth versus Hispanic youth versus all families with children versus single mother families with children, a poverty rate of 1/3 and higher. 1/3 and higher. We get used to these numbers? We shouldn't. How about since the economic crisis? Well, again, the burdens play out across different groups in somewhat different ways. Here you see white poverty experiencing a pretty significant increase, but not as big an increase as black poverty. This will not surprise anybody here, I'm quite sure. I don't know how much more of this you can handle, but I'm getting to the end of the grim lists here. But this one is, I think, quite striking. Deep poverty. Deep poverty is defined as households living at 1/2 or less of a poverty income. Deep poverty has been rising. Almost 7% of the population now lives in deep poverty. We are talking about an individual income of on the order of $11,000 a year. Those of you who complain about stipends for research assistants, and you're doing better than that, not a lot. So there is more to the story. When we look at the poverty rate, we don't see what's going on underneath it. The proportion of those in poverty who are now not just living in poverty, but living in deep poverty has been growing since 2007. And that trend actually began in 1999 with some ups and downs. And although it would be very hard to show with a model, I will make some connections to the decisions that have been made about social policy in the period beginning in the mid-1990s, not the least of which was welfare reform, which I really think is linked, at least to part of this problem of deep poverty. So, to the market. What's the market do for us? Well, at certain times, the market gives us opportunity, and at other times, it doesn't. Currently, we have a market in which 15.1% of those who are actively looking for work are unemployed. We know the unemployment figures don't show the entire unemployment picture. We also know that those who are not unemployed, those who are working, 1 in 5 workers earn below poverty wages. So it's not just unemployment, it's also what does work offer. And finally, we know that work, even if the wage is good, can be contingent and unstable. And those of you who want to hear more about that, I invite you to Susan Lambert and Julie Henley's presentation coming up, because they got the book on this story. So the way people manage in the market is not just a matter of individual desire, effort, or skill. It's also a matter of what the market has to offer. And the market, particularly when it is dynamic, it restructures all the time. Markets change. We went from a rural economy to an industrial economy, from an industrial economy to a service economy, from a service economy potentially to a financial economy. Markets change, but this affects people who at different times then kind of fall off the table because there's nothing, the market no longer needs them. So when work is not enough, here are figures for working families living below 200% of poverty, so the so-called working poor. Work, the ability of work to sustain a family, you can see the value has declined, so that we now have some 30% of working households that are just squeaking by. Okay, the litany. I'm done with the litany. Whew, take a breath. So the question is, what can governments do to reduce the risks of market flexibility? That is, markets that pull you in, spit you out, give you opportunities, take them away. And inequality, which we know is structured into markets. In the US, I'm simplifying here, but you don't want me talking for 3 hours, I'm sure. In the US, there are essentially 2 tracks for this policy adjustment. We have, in effect, a 2-tier safety net, one for those that are treated as workers, and then those who are not. For those who are treated as workers, what this generally is a category of people who are involved in the core economy to the extent that they have relatively stable jobs and work life over times. So this enables them to be eligible for unemployment insurance and other kinds of benefits. But as we know, these jobs may disappear, or they may not pay enough. So for those that we regard as workers, some of the major policy instruments to supplement their income from work is unemployment insurance for those who lose jobs and qualify. Unemployment insurance, which ranges from 24 weeks to 99 weeks. As I'm sure many of you know, the 24 weeks is guaranteed or under federal law. The rest is more discretionary, and at the moment, the federal program that pays for the supplement to 99 weeks is set to expire in January. And people who have been out of work for more than whatever their state allows, which is 24 to 50 some weeks, will simply no longer receive unemployment insurance unless Congress acts on this before January. The other 2 programs we can think as a boost for those who are either in low-wage jobs or don't have enough work hours is the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and SNAP used to be called food stamps. I still like to say food stamps because that actually tells you what it is, and SNAP sounds like a scene from Clueless, snaps. So, yeah, I really did cite Clueless. Yes, I did. This may be the University of Chicago, but if you like movies. For others, for those who do not have a regular spot in the labor market, we also have food stamps, but food stamps for non-workers are conditional on participating in various kinds of work requirements, so it's not quite the same. And of course, we have TANF, formerly welfare, which is both temporary and conditional. And then for those who are regarded as medically out of the workforce, there's disability and SSI. So, key benefits for workers, we talked about it, unemployment insurance, EITC. Again, the EITC, which is very effective, depends on how much you work. You don't work, EITC doesn't help you. For those without work or sufficient work attachment, as they call it, again, SNAP, TANF only, however, applies to families, not individuals. And the programs that states used to use at their discretion called general assistance for poor individuals without families, most of those have pretty much disappeared or been reduced to a fairly pitiful amount. But the programs such as we have them do work. Again, possibilities. If you look just at the numbers of people lifted out of poverty by some of these benefits, EITC, 5.1 million people. Okay, we have 46 million poor people, but 5 million people, it's a start. Food stamps, 4 million. Housing assistance, 4 million. SSI, almost 4 million. TANF, 1.4 million, and declining, like, as we speak. So, how well are these programs responding to the Great Recession? How are they working now? Again, some of them have made a difference. This refers, the red part is the American Recovery Act, a temporary federal program the Obama administration was able to put into place to supplement existing benefit programs. It has now expired. So lop off the red part for going forward. But we see, and again, that's the 99 weeks business for unemployment insurance. So we're talking 2.2 million people could lose unemployment insurance if the 99 weeks provision disappears. The Making Work Pay tax credit, child tax credit, and EITC. EITC is big. Food stamps, and then these other general economic recovery payments. I think it's interesting that TANF didn't even make it onto the chart, but I have it on other charts. SNAP has been reasonably responsive to the recession. You can see that SNAP enrollment has certainly increased and moved in directions that are similar to the unemployment rate. And in fact, now surpassing it, but I think there is some pent-up demand. To say that it's fully responsive, I think would be going too far, and any of you who work in food pantries know that, yes, SNAP enrollment is up, but SNAP is insufficient for many families to make ends meet, and so they now turn to food pantries. Again, if you want to compare SNAP to TANF, well, the blue line is the number of unemployed, the green line is SNAP, and TANF has stayed relatively flat. It is very hard to get, and it is even harder to keep. And of course, we have a 5-year lifetime limit on income assistance through TANF, Some states have now cut this back to 2 years and are reducing benefit levels as well. So TANF's anti-poverty effectiveness. Isn't what it used to be. And yet TANF was predicated on the idea that work was the answer for everybody. Let's have welfare to work. Everybody's going to do well. They'll feel good about themselves. The economy will benefit. Well, what's welfare to work without work? Has Congress considered changing the provisions that require work in this period? No, they've raised them. Okay, don't get me started. Poverty up, access to TANF down 60% nationally. Where welfare, AFDC, used to bring 82 out of 100 families out of poverty, by 2009, TANF was bringing 27 out of 100 families out of poverty. Same story. Illinois, are we doing any better? No. In Illinois, the poverty rate is up and the TANF recipient caseload is down by 86% since the start of the program. 86%. There's almost nothing left for poor families in Illinois. Here's the link I was suggesting to you before. Should we be surprised that deep poverty for families with children has worsened? TANF isn't the whole story. It's just one policy. But it was a safety net for 79 of 100 of these families. And now it's not. Nationally, you see TANF down, families with children in poverty and deep poverty up. So the question I want to return to, can we do better? What is possible? Is anything possible? Should we just say, this was really grim, I'm going home, I don't want to hear another word? Ooh, I think some of you were saying yes. Well, I could understand that feeling. I could. Can we do better? What is the state perspective? It's hard for states to do better because states are subject to constitutional fiscal constraints. They don't have counter-cyclical fiscal capacity. They are squeezed. They're taking less money in. At the same time, the needs are rising. So I'm actually sympathetic. I wouldn't want to be a governor right now. It's a really tough situation. And as I mentioned, many states are now cutting benefits, including TANF, and a number of states had, in addition to the federal EITC, they had state EITCs. They're getting rid of this. They are lopping things off right and left. What strikes me as odd is that they aren't doing everything they could to bring in the federal dollars that still exist out there. Although SNAP is going up, it could be going up much further than it is. And it's a win-win for the states. It's not their money. And it underwrites consumption, because if you get SNAP benefits, you spend it at the neighborhood grocery store. There's no externality. The money comes in and it gets spent and it stays in. And it's a bit of a mystery to me why states and cities don't make more of an effort here than they have. And one of the possibilities is, where else can we think of these kinds of win-win situations to leverage the federal money that's out there? EITC does some of that. Again, there's outreach. Could be more. Could be more. Why wouldn't you want to maximize your return on these federal dollars and bring that money into your state? Nationally, can we do better? Well, it depends what kind of future we want, right? Here is what the national random sample of people who took the "what country do you want to live in" test had to say. Only 10% of them, same as here. No, here was less. 10% of them said they wanted to live in the US. 10% of Americans, when given a choice, said they wanted to live in the US. They all want to be Swedes. Who knew? Who knew? Or live in Fredonia with all of you. But 90% of Americans want more equality. Anybody see a possibility in this? But there's a problem. Oh, okay, before I get to the problem, well, I'll get to the problem, then I'll come back to the good news. The problem is they don't know how much inequality we have. When asked to guess which country was which, people didn't guess the US was country 3. How much inequality do they, here's a chart that shows actual inequality, and then what people say is their ideal, the Swedish model, and then what people think we have. And they know we have inequality, but they don't realize how much. So one problem is people have to understand what the reality is. And that's one reason I spent a lot of time going through what the reality is for us. But the good news, if you look across these different groups, it's really quite remarkable. Everybody wants more equality. Rich people want more equality. Poor people want more equality. Republican voters want more equality. Democratic voters want more equality. Who knew? Now, okay, it's survey research or people saying what they really believe. I don't know. But it's pretty provocative. There's possibility here. If Americans really want more equality, but they don't know we don't have it, but they'd like to get it, how does this make us think about what's possible? It's maybe not just us and them. Maybe it's us. So, questions for America's future. What kind of future do we want? How should we use government to balance the market's need for flexibility with society's need for security and well-being? How much inequality is acceptable and sustainable in a democracy? What should government do? And how do we take these glimmers of possibility and turn them into reality? So on behalf of political imagination, I have quotations here from a speech that I thought was pretty amazing. Today we stand committed to the proposition that freedom is no half and half affair. If the average citizen is guaranteed equal opportunity in the polling place, he or she, it's stated, must have equal opportunity in the marketplace. Equal opportunity in the marketplace. We are poor indeed if this nation cannot afford to lift from every recess of American life the dread fear of the unemployed that they are not needed in the world. You're starting to wonder who this is? You're going to say. Governments can err, presidents make mistakes, but the immortal Dante tells us that divine justice weighs the sins of the cold-blooded and the sins of the warm-hearted in different scales. Better the occasional faults of a government that lives in a spirit of charity than the constant omissions of a government frozen in the ice of its own indifference. There's a mysterious cycle in human events. To some generations, much is given. Of other generations, much is expected. This generation of Americans has a rendezvous with destiny. Franklin Roosevelt gave this speech in 1936. I think he's talking to you today.